going to be from college, and then I'm going to go back to an experience in high school. (1969). Before my sophomore year of college, I signed up for an experiential college course. Now, I had many choices, but I chose power structure analysis. Can you imagine kids today going, I want my power structure analysis? Anyway, as part of this course, we had an internship in the community, and that's where I met Nate. Nate was this elderly man who lived on the other south side of Chicago, the black side of the dividing line. And Nate was so nice. He kind of had this Mr. Rogers sort of vibe. He even wore a cardigan sweater. And I went to interview Nate several times because he was like a living, breathing history book. Now, the first time I went to interview him, I noticed that there were several houses on his block that were boarded up. One looked like it had had a fire pretty recently. But Nate's house, he had this wonderful geranium rose garden right in front underneath the bay window. And he had a full yard of grass. Most of the yards were just dirt. And a welcome mat at his door. And he welcomed me when I came in by handing me a glass of sassafras tea. Iced sassafras tea. I'd never had it before. It smelled so good. With a gleam in his eye, he handed it to me and said, this was my wife's favorite. Now, I had told him that I was wanting to look into Chicago segregation. And he launched right in. He eased himself into his lazy boy recliner. And he said offhandedly, as if it were common knowledge, he said, Chicago wasn't always segregated. What? I mean, he'd already blown my mind. He said, no, up until 1920, there wasn't really what you call a white and black part of town. What happened? I asked. He said, I'm not saying there wasn't racial tension. There was racial tension, mostly over jobs. There were fights at the stockyards and factories. So my grandpa worked at the stockyards. And then I was too embarrassed to say the rest of the story my grandpa said, which was that he lost his job to black people. But it was as if Nate could read my mind. He said, and I bet your grandpa didn't keep that job either. See, they handed out flyers down south advertising that there were great jobs up north, like at the Chicago stockyards. And they literally packed people into trains, into cattle cars, and they drove those trains right into the stockyards, brought in black workers to bust the white workers who were talking union. Okay, that was a part of the story I had never heard. So, Nate said, there was a race riot in 1990. And instead of helping the tension, they separated black and white people. The city leaders decided to set up separate residential areas. For instance, he said, the city council voted what they called restrictive covenants. It said that certain areas of the city, and this is a quote, he held up his finger, could only be occupied by people wholly of white or Caucasian race. And in the areas they were trying to make all white, they'd go up to the houses where some of the black people lived, and they'd knock on the door and they'd offer them money to move, or threaten them to move, or they'd get the storekeepers to refuse to sell anything to the black people who lived there. I mean, a loaf of bread or even stamps at the post office. So Nate poured himself another glass of tea. I hadn't taken a sip yet. He said, but in the black areas they set up, it was too small for all the people already living there, and all the people were coming up from the south every day. Oh man, those landlords made a mint selling to blacks who were desperate for housing. They divide and subdivide each apartment. That way they get 3 and 4 times the rent they got from one family before. And they'd hang up some electrical wires, light bulbs in the attic, the basement, even a coal bin. And they'd call those makeshift rooms apartments. Make a fortune. And then Nate's voice got quiet. He said, so many fires in those overcrowded, dilapidated buildings. We had a saying, down south they lynch us, up north they fry us. I had nothing to say to that. We sat in silence for a while. And then, as if talking to himself, Nate muttered, but where could we go? There were no open housing laws back then. Now, my third visit, these history lessons from Nate finally got a little more personal. That day I asked him, when did you move to this house? 1962, he told me, and he handed me our now traditional sassafras tea. He eased himself into his recliner. He said, The realtors opened up the block next to where we lived in the Black Belt. They opened up a couple blocks in the adjoining white neighborhood. Oh, we saved and we saved, he said, because banks wouldn't sell us mortgages. It cost us a fortune to move across the color line. But I thought I was doing something good for my family. I thought we had a nice place, but we learned pretty quick that we were only being used to turn that neighborhood. We stuck it out, though, he told me, even when whites threw burning rags into our house. But the worst was when the realtors started to buy up some of these houses around here. They brought in prostitutes, drugs, arson, anything they could to scare the white people out. That was the name of the game back then. Buy low from the whites, sell high to the blacks, make a fortune. Well, I said, did you talk to anybody about it, complain? Oh, yeah, we complained, he said. We said, hey, nice middle-class neighborhoods turning lower class, but the realtors making millions, the police on the take, the politicians on the take, they just look the other way. But still, Nate said, all the time, white people come back sightseeing. Every week or so, another carload of them sitting in front of our houses and crying. I always wanted to come out and say, well, why did you leave then? And what the heck kind of control do you think we had over any of this? I would have been a good neighbor to you, but now I gotta move too. I had never thought about how our car lines with the ladies to look at their old houses affected the people who lived in those houses. I didn't know that segregation had been forced. I didn't know that black and white neighborhoods had been created. High school. I needed to start to learn some of the larger forces at work. 1965. Those discussions on the front porch, when it turned to race, they could get tense. Well, if the colored move in here, we're moving out. Yeah, they're not going to keep up their places, and why shouldn't they? If we did it, they can do it. We raised ourselves up. And the noon news back then went from 5 minutes to 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. And suddenly we're seeing more and more pictures of civil rights demonstrations down south, and that really got some of the neighbors going. Oh, civil rights demonstrators, they're troublemakers. Things can't change that fast. And I think, well, at least we're not the South. And sometimes the racial discussions would threaten the unity on the front porch. So one of the ladies who saw herself as a peacemaker, she'd signal, hey, that's enough now, by saying, oh, well, there's good and bad in every race. And that would kind of calm things down. The only thing left to discuss was how many good of each and how many bad. Now, most of the ladies knew there was more bad in their race, and they had police officers. Or as I said, the new arrivals from changing neighborhoods and their stories. But the biggest proof of all was how people kept up their houses, how much garbage was around people's houses. Once or twice a year, I would take the elevated train downtown to shop at Marshall Fields with the ladies from the block. And the L on the south side zoomed you behind the 3 flats and apartment buildings in all black neighborhoods. You could actually look down into people's yards. And for the more prejudiced sounding ladies, it was like, hey, take a look. I rest my case. Look at all the garbage. And sometime, as we zoomed by, you could see them looking down, mentally counting, adding it up. Bad, bad, bad. Well, see, good. She can do it. They can do it. Bad, bad. And sometimes even whisper, would you like to live with that? And the L would stop at each stop, and those doors would slice open and close, and I would rack my brain for something to say back to the more prejudiced-sounding ladies, but I didn't have any proof. And then one day, I had my chance to go get some. One of the radical nuns at my high school, Queen of Peace High School, had started a civil rights youth group. And she took a few of us girls across the color line to the west side to a group called the Lawndale Association, a group of people in an all-black neighborhood who met to make their community better. And we met some wonderful people there, and there were 2 ladies there that I especially got fond of, Nona and May. Now, my mom had died that year, and these ladies kind of took me under their wing, kind of adopted me, and I was adoptable. Nona was thin with multiple skirts on, dressed in her Sunday best. Remember that fashion? Lots of slips underneath your dress. And then May had a mink stole on with the dead head of the mink stole. Do you remember those, right? Well, we went down to the rectory basement where the meeting was taking place, and I was getting good evidence. The Lawndale people were doing all sorts of good things. They were starting what we would call now a neighborhood watch patrol. And they were trying to get a church to open up their gymnasium at 3 o'clock so the kids had something to do after school. And the people were so nice there that they went through the agenda item. And I mean, Nona was practically holding my hand, tapping it, explaining all the background on all the agenda items to us girls. And I needed some explanation when we got to the last agenda item, garbage demonstration at City Hall. Now, as you can imagine from my upbringing, demonstrators, troublemakers, right? But everybody had been so nice that I guess I felt free to ask questions. And I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you, or one book or one film changes your life. But the next 3-minute conversation changed my life like 180 degrees. I said, well, what are you going to demonstrate about? And Nona said, they make us live in filth. I said, how could anyone make you live in filth? And John, the leader of the group, said, the sanitation department says they come in here, but somebody's palming a few bucks. I said, wait a minute, how could they get away with that? And John looked at me with disbelief. He said, we don't have no clout. We're expendable. And all at once, this view from the street was so different than our view from the L. My perspective was changing from people who didn't care, or people who needed to be shown how, to people setting their garbage out every week, but the garbage trucks never coming. They just never came. And May said, I spent every last dime I can on garbage cans because the landlord won't. Don't got to, Nona said. He knows if we complain and move out, he's got 15 more families ready to move in. With not enough places for us to live, it don't matter how we keep up that place, he'll rent it. I said, you don't own your own home? And Nona said, I used to. I pay on my place for 15 years, and I missed one payment, and whoosh, out on the street. In May, she leaned over to me, she said, Nona, she worked as a maid, but she broke her hip. I said, well, no, wait a minute. They can't kick you out after only one missed mortgage payment. It takes months to foreclose, right? And I knew something about this because my dad worked part-time as a loan officer at Tallman Bank. Nona said, they can kick you out after only one miss because we can't get a regular loan. We have to buy a contract for deed from an individual without the protection of a regular bank. And the white man, he knows it too, sells to somebody can't get no steady job. Take their down payment, their life savings, they pay on the place, maybe 6 months, 7 months, a year, get laid off and miss one payment, take back the house and all the money they have in it, sell it all over again, take somebody else's down payment. But I didn't last in my house 6 months or 7 months, 1 year or two. I pay on that place for 15 years. I only had 2 more years till I own it, when wish the man take it back and all the money I had into it. But I can tell you one thing I am proud of, Nona said. I didn't steal nothing when I left neither. Oh, I asked, what would you steal? And May started laughing. She said, oh, honey, I've seen people leaving those houses with the plumbing. I didn't get it. Why, I asked. Sell it off, child, Nona said. Piping, sinks, toilets, get some of their money back. And all at once, I remembered being 10 years old at Ale's Bar in Kedzie Avenue. It was like an Irish pub. My folks would go up there a few nights a week. The adults sat at the bar. We kids sat at tables in the back room, drinking orange knee-high and eating pretzels. And one night, there was a man in there, a big shot, my dad called him, because he was from the neighborhood. He owned a lot of real estate, but he wasn't really like one of us somehow. He always talked real loud and bragged a bunch. And one day, in this big voice, he just said, oh, those people, they don't take care of our places. I've gone in there and they've taken the plumbing, the lighting fixtures. I tell you, every last light bulb and electrical switch of those people, they live like animals. My mind came back to the Lawndale meeting with what I thought could be a possible solution. Now, I was just a high school kid, but I was a Chicago high school kid. We like to think we know something about the political ropes. Mr. Burke, our precinct captain, just lived a few doors away. So I said, I offered, could you talk to your alderman about these problems? And there was complete silence. And then peals of laughter. The Lawndale people could not contain themselves. They were laughing till they were wiping tears off their face. And Nona kept trying. She could see I was embarrassed. She kept trying to get herself together, and she burst out laughing. Finally, she squeezed my hand and said, oh, honey, our alderman, some rich man, lives down by the lake. We don't ever see him. So in one 3-minute conversation, I learned that the city people on the west side didn't have the same representation as us, didn't have the same chance to buy things, didn't have the same city services. And these houses we were always looking at to make sure they were kept up were owned by a bunch of white guys. And the thought came to me, oh my God, we are the South.